Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kata Beilin, Faculty Director of Latin American, Caribbean, and Iberian Studies program here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And I have a great pleasure to welcome you third talk in our series on science and technology in the Hispanic world that our program, LASIS, prepared in collaboration with the Holt Center on Science and Technology Studies, also at UW. This talk is also sponsored for the Center for History and Environment, so-called CHE. So right now I would like to say thank you to all our sponsors and co-sponsors and remind everyone that in the series we still have one more talk forthcoming on April 20th. Birgit Müller will talk to us from Paris on her work on Nicaraguan agriculture, and her talk is titled Facing the Environmental Mission, Small Farmers in Nicaragua and the Agroecological Challenges in the Neoliberal Food Regime. So right now, I have a pleasure to welcome and introduce our today's speaker, Professor Kregg Hetherington. Is an environmental anthropologist at Concordia University in Canada, who specializes in agrarian transitions, environmental politics, and what he calls bureaucratic state in Latin America. And we can ask him what it means. He also directs Concordia Ethnography Lab, where he leads a project on Montreal changing relationship to water. And he's an author of 2 volumes and 1 edited volume. The first one is titled The Government of Beans, Regulating Life in the Age of Monocrops. I think this is the second one, Guerrilla Auditors, The Politics of Transparency in Neoliberal Paraguay, that I read from the beginning to the end, as if it was a novel before reserved to Paraguay. And he's also an editor of Structure, Environment, and Life in the Anthropocene, all 3 volumes published in prestigious series in Duke University Press. And I'm really very excited for today's talk because I believe that Kregg Hetherington is one of the most interesting voices in today's anthropology of Latin America, whose research draws not only from very sophisticated conceptual frameworks, throughout historical research, but is also based on personal experience of the realities about which he writes. And I encourage you to ask him about those experiences if we have time after the talk. So right now, not to take any more time from him, welcome Kregg to Madison. We are going to be very much looking forward to your lecture.
Thank you so much for that. That was a very, very generous introduction. I'm very happy to be here, and I do want to thank everyone who helped organize this, especially Kata. It's been really nice to be in contact the last few months. And to all of you for coming, and you're still arriving, so that's great. So I'm just going to share my screen here. Hopefully this works well. I will be talking about the book that Kata mentioned, which actually I think I have a cover over here. So the Government of Beans, and this is a project that I've been empirically very deep and steeped in for the last 10 or 11 years. So there's a lot of detail that we could go into, and I really open questions. I'm going to keep this talk at a fairly high level of generality to just kind of talk about some of the issues that come out of this book, and particularly I thought I'd frame them in relationship to a conversation that I know has been quite dynamic on the Madison campus the last couple of years, which is thinking about the relationship between environmental justice and the Plantationocene. I do think of this book on the one hand as a case study of regulation, regulating environment and agriculture in Paraguay, but I also think about it as an allegory for Anthropocenic governance problems. And so I want to kind of lay out the way that works in my thinking here. Now, the Plantationocene, of course, is this gloriously awkward neologism associated with Donna Haraway and Anna Singh, and to which I owe a tremendous amount of debt. So I'm really swimming in the same waters. Like Haraway and Singh, I'm talking about the industrial entanglements of plants and humans. I'm talking about the cataclysmic loss of biodiversity as capital seeks to simplify biological production, and about the loss of refuges for people and plants that are hard to commodify. In talking about soybeans as well, I'm talking about a quintessential example of what Jason Moore calls the rise of cheap nature and the devastating ecological and social costs that follow from that. But from the beginning, when I started talking about soybean monocrops in South America, I've been kind of called on to call these things plantations, and I've always found that nomenclature a little bit uncomfortable, because while I recognize landscapes like this as tremendous sites of disciplinary power, of violence, extreme forms of life and death, and explore those in a lot of detail in the book, I never want to confuse them with the specific forms of violence, discipline, and life associated with chattel slavery. And this is not just because of some sensitivity about historical exceptionalism, although perhaps the sensitivity is what started my discomfort. But much more because I think that the specificity of how laboring bodies and plants come together in these sorts of landscapes is really vital to understanding our way out of what I've called the age of monocrops. So the specific agrarian assemblage of plants and bodies that I'm most interested in here involves a lot more moral and political ambiguity to our time. I'm talking about the Green Revolution, which occurred roughly after World War II and transformed agrarian technologies, not only in genetics and fertilizers, which tends to be what people hear about, but in the techniques of government necessary to maintain expanding monocrops. And we can now recognize that the agriculture that emerges from this period is an environmental catastrophe, one of the leading causes of climate change and biodiversity loss, a driver of deforestation, wildfires, and even the zoonotic illnesses that have redefined our lives in the last year. They've also participated in resource and wealth concentration, which from the front lines of these kinds of advancing fields feel like this seemingly unstoppable slow violence, and not always slow either. But I also want to trouble this image by acknowledging that the Green Revolution was, among other things, a welfare project. It was aimed at curbing hunger, disease, poverty, and war by disposing useful plants to greater and greater potency. So it's easy to say that industrial agriculture as we know it today poses an existential threat to human well-being. But my question is, what if our operative notion of human well-being is entangled in that very understanding of industrial agriculture from the beginning? So I found it useful to step back from the notion of the Plantationocene and reach for an even worse neologism, agribiopolitics. Rather than point to a place and time, for me, agribiopolitics is really a methodological proposition, a way of asking about how both plant health and human well-being are entangled together in modern forms of government. So the term, of course, comes from an engagement with Foucault's notions of biopolitics. One could stretch out that genealogy, as I do in other places. But here we'll just put a pin in Foucault's name. And I want to be clear here that I'm not trying to add another voice to the Foucauldian canon, but I find his work really interesting to think with in this context. So famously, of course, for Foucault, biopolitics comes from the inversion of sovereign power, which was the power to kill or let live, and biopolitics is the practice of making live, of regulating and fostering life at the level of human populations. And you can think about the rise of public health as being one of the key examples of this. Now, tellingly, in Foucault's lectures, the first biopolitical intervention that he talks about were responses to food crises in 18th century France. Paris was growing and industrializing, and the city could only survive on a stable supply of grain. And shortage of bread, even for very short periods, was not just a question of individual survival, but of urban and national security. Biopolitics arose in this story as the practice of calculating human biological necessities at the level of the population and intervening in the grain supplies so that hunger didn't become revolution. But then, oddly, Foucault dropped the question of grain altogether. And for the next few decades, biopolitical analysis was mostly concerned with sexuality, public health, genocide, racism, state violence, and not agriculture. So in fact, in this story, you can already see agriculture disappearing in this 18th century starting point. So he, like other commentators on famine during that period, generally talks about grain or bread and not specific plants, the wheat and rye, which were the main things going into the bread. And one has to go to an entirely different literature to realize that those grain shortages were often caused by new plant diseases that were attracted to grain monocrops. A concentration of people in the cities produced new biological vulnerabilities for humans. The mirror concentration of monocrop grain in rural areas produced analogous vulnerabilities for plants. So one of these diseases, black stem rot, was so devastating to wheat crops in this period that the French state began to create its first phytosanitary laws, prohibiting the planting of certain crops that were thought to spread the disease. In other words, the very first cases of phytosanitary regulation were born not only at the same time as biopolitics, but for the same reasons. This segregation into increasingly homogeneous populations of beings. So you can think then of agribiopolitics in the 1790s as being this kind of division, public health and welfare institutions for the cities, while plant health and agrarian regulation was proper to the countryside. And then we can take this one step further, because of course Foucault is not interested in the 1790s just for the sake of that period. He's interested in a genealogy of the welfare state of the mid-20th century, project which was focused on human well-being and largely ignored or tried to minimize in different ways human entanglements with other living beings. So we can see the distinctly colonial tilt of Foucault's method, because if in Europe the welfare state was in full bloom in the way that he describes, its mirror in the global south, primarily Asia and Latin America, was the Green Revolution, that great experiment in supersizing plant life. And so we can scale up our dictum, and with only a little bit of exaggeration, talk about agribiopolitics of the 1960s as being public health and welfare for the global north, and plant health and agrarian development for the global south. Now, this is all a simplification, and I'm happy to have it pulled apart at different points, but I'm just trying to lay out some roadmaps here. So my project is not only about trying to fill in the agrarian aspects of Cold War biopolitics, but to try, in a sense, to partially decolonize it by asking what the process looked like at those sites where the great investments in human welfare were made through investments in plant life. As I mentioned at the outset, this project is also genealogical for me, and I'm trying to understand how we end up in the age of monocrops, this moment where agriculture is so expansive, so destructive, and seemingly so untethered from notions of environmental or human well-being. So the specific monocrop that I've spent too much time in and around is this field of soybeans that sits over much of southern South America. In Paraguay alone, the crop, which is represented here with a darker shade, reaches 4 million hectares, or about half of the country's arable land is covered in soybeans. And this is territory that only 60 years ago was mostly covered in forest. So I won't have time to delve into the spatial peculiarities of this, but I hope the map can at least evoke that monocrops like this one are political entities as much as they are anything else. The blob sits over a border, and every year it moves westward and northward. It brings with it new languages, new technologies, and is often compared to a military invasion. And you'll see sort of sparkles of that throughout. But what I really want to talk about here is the way that this develops in time. So I think of the story of soybeans as one that goes through 3 chapters. And you can take a slice, if you go back to that gray blob, you can take a slice of time out of almost anywhere there, and you'll see versions of these three slides over time. So if 60 years ago the landscape was covered in the subtropical Atlantic forest, 30 years ago it was a modeled landscape of small farms and ranches. And the soy that occupies that territory now does so as a new and aggressive form of life that mostly lives through the elimination of these other two projects. And as we'll see in the sort of social justice narratives that come out of it, those are really the ways that soy ends up being thought of as an antagonist, as an antagonist of those two potential or ideal landscapes. Now, it's tempting to think of this in terms of a Turnerian frontier narrative. And of course, that American pioneer story very much operates in Southern South America. And it's not entirely wrong. But if we think of these landscapes not just as slices in a progression of waves, but rather as distinct agribiopolitical regimes, we can appreciate a little bit more how novel the forms of government and thinking are that are proper to each one. Each of these regimes has its own logic, its own way of understanding plants and plant health, and how these relate to human society, what technologies and institutions are needed to hold these relations in place. So I'm going to go through each of these chapters in some detail, but let me anticipate the argument I eventually want to arrive at, that the environmental and environmental justice narratives that have grown up around soybeans have been structured according to a simplified version of this triptych. There's no shortage of people saying we should abolish soybeans in order to return to the forest over on the far left, and others saying we should get rid of the soybeans in order to bring back peasant life in the middle, and there are entire institutions devoted to those exact projects. But this leads to an environmental protection of a kind of zoned countryside in which these three landscapes can coexist, held apart by laws and physical barriers. By telling the story as a triptych instead, I want to open up the possibility that in fact all of these landscapes are a projection of a monocrop, each maintaining a distinct vision of purity which is in the aggregate unsustainable. Together they conspire to make soybeans what they are today. So get to the first chapter here. Like all the others, this is part of a global story. It has a local and a global component to it. In the end of the 19th century, crop science takes this massive leap forward, where genetic techniques produce hybrid plants which had a productivity and force never before seen in farmers' fields. And this started an institutionalization of crop science, which would make agrarian governance more and more complex from then on. Now, just to underline how key a scientific moment this is for small agrarian countries like Paraguay, the conjuncture is basically considered the beginning of Paraguayan science. And this guy here, Moisés Santiago Bertoni, a Swiss botanist and polymath who arrived in Paraguay in 1886, is still remembered as the grandfather of national science, kind of like the Thomas Edison of Paraguay. He built the country's first agronomy school. He started the first scientific journal. He wrote over 500 books and articles on botany, zoology, philosophy, ecology, geography, entomology, climatology, history, linguistics, and anthropology. Thousands and thousands of pages all cranked out on a hand press in his house in the jungle. And today, Bertoni is still known as El Sabio. There are a lot of Bertonis in Paraguay, but if you want to talk about him, you ask about the sage, El Sabio Bertoni. But although his personality looms really large in Paraguayan history, few scholars really know what to make of those published works. And I interviewed lots of agronomists and anthropologists and descendants of his about his legacy, and all gave this kind of sideways smirk, saying there wasn't much value in the science itself. And for the biologists, Bertoni had an annoying way of anthropomorphizing plants, of ascribing to them social values like egalitarianism and democracy, while becoming overwhelmed with a mystical reverence for plant life that he would sort of wax eloquent about and made some of his stuff sound very unscientific to them. Anthropologists had just the opposite problem. And in fact, they often told me that the botany stuff was really good, but the anthropology was terrible. The reason for them was that he biologized Paraguayan culture, producing a theory of mestizaje that glorified racial mixing of humans and plants and would later be recognized as having fascist undertones. So Bertoni's thought belonged to a popular philosophical movement known as vitalism. And in its most basic form, turn-of-the-century vitalism posited that all life processes were animated by a substance or a vital force that transcended the physico-chemical composition of matter. He uses all these terms. For Bertoni, this vital force resonated most in the forest, was always about relational properties, about beings coexisting with other beings and thus becoming stronger. But so at his core, he was an agronomist who saw farming as a project of assembling vital organisms together into collectives that, like the forest, would live or die on the strength of the relationships between them. He wrote practical guides to growing crops that included psychological, social, and spiritual advice alongside cutting-edge agronomic techniques that he carried out in his own experimental plots. In that synthesis of all of these different ways of understanding what life could be, there's a kind of earnestness about relationships that allows one to think about the complexity of agriculture that by the mid-20th century would become quite unusual. But in his time, it was fairly common, and it has resonances with all sorts of figures, from Justus von Liebig to Rudolf Steiner to José Vasconcelos. It more or less disappeared after World War II, and with good reason. And I've already mentioned that people start reading him as a proto-fascist after the war. And in fact, there's a huge amount of resonance in the way that he describes agronomy with European fascism. So creating better humans in the fascist imaginary was always linked to creating better plants and animals. Mussolini had his noble wheat. Franco had his Spanish pigs. The Nazis talked about their German potatoes that needed to be protected from invading hordes of foreign insects. Fascist agronomy was what we would call today post-human or more than human, the study of the relationship between human communities and their non-human companions. And there are, of course, more than just resonances here. Paraguay had its own short-lived fascist government in 1936, and Bertoni's son was their agriculture minister. And only a decade later, of course, Paraguay would be notoriously welcoming to Nazis fleeing the Nuremberg trials in a way that was uncomfortable for social scientists writing at that time. So in Paraguay as elsewhere, biological racism began to fade out of the social sciences, and speculation about human character faded even more quickly out of the agronomic science. But the weird thing is that while anti-racism for the social sciences meant a complete change of epistemology and methodology, in agronomy very little changed other than the political rhetoric. After the war, fascist agriculture was converted into liberal agriculture, using the same techniques, but now saying that one had to create super wheat not to fortify a specific nation of superhumans, but more abstractly to feed the world. The human of agronomy became a universal human, subject to equal rights, but the plants and animals were still everywhere races to be genetically improved in more and more sophisticated ways. Now, by leaving out the relationships between people and plants, what was lost was the ecological sensibility of a thinker like Bertoni, who was relegated, along with a number of other people I named, to the mystical margins of alternative agriculture. So, in the second chapter of this story, chemical advancements achieved during World War II are reinvested into agriculture, offering new pesticides and fertilizers to improve and protect crop varieties. In Paraguay, the Green Revolution revolved around cotton produced by smallholders for the export market. Now, there's a lot of complexity here, which I can't get into. This was also a period of brutal dictatorship in the country. But the main point is that the Green Revolution harnessed the insights of fascist agriculture and coupled it with a rural welfare project. And that's what it was called, Bienestar Rural, through these advances in agrarian technologies. Now, this regime had a really different epistemology to it. It was less connected to 19th century German Romanticism and more to Anglo-American liberalism through international development aid. And the person in charge of the cotton revolution in Paraguay was the grandson of Moises Bertoni, the nephew of the previous ag minister. This is a guy named Hernando Bertoni who left his grandfather's ag school in the 40s on a Rockefeller grant and came home to lead agriculture in the country for the next 30 years. Hernando leveraged international money and expertise to make this happen. French cotton scientists created new varieties specific to Paraguay. The Inter-American Development Bank built new agriculture infrastructure. USAID and the Brazilians built the highways and ports that would allow for export. And finally, the Alliance for Progress funded the creation of land reform project that the US was promoting throughout the region as an anti-communist gesture. The combination of new technologies and newly available land in the forests of eastern Paraguay rapidly transformed the entire region, creating hundreds of cotton colonies in the middle of the forest, which were there until about 2 decades ago. During the 60s and 70s, cotton was the most important plant in the Paraguayan economy, and it drove rapid economic growth, sometimes as much as 12% per year, this during the 70s when a lot of the rest of the region was in recession. Families lived and died on the success of their cotton production, so that cotton soon became part of a whole nationalist ideology in which upwardly mobile peasants saw their identities expressed in the plant. Cotton also was the way that the Stroessner dictatorship extended itself throughout the eastern forests, creating powerful client networks for the ruling Colorado Party and converting itself into one of the longest lasting regimes in the region. And yet the welfare policies themselves made very little reference to cotton. These things kind of stayed apart. Instead, it spoke about harnessing human labor through land. It was all about people and land. That was the key parts of the discourse. Infrastructure, and to a certain extent, agrarian improvements. And as such, it had very little to say about the specific biological relationships that pioneers were developing with other living beings in this area. So as with any large-scale reorganization of the landscape, the Green Revolution was also a violent process which benefited particular Paraguayan humans and particular Paraguayan plants to the exclusion, sometimes annihilation, of others. Cotton began the process of converting the countryside into the sort of simplified landscape appropriate for large-scale monocrops. This is the first step of what will later become soybeans. Indeed, it was a condition of the land reform that beneficiaries of plots in the forest would start by destroying that forest, which in legal terms became their first act of possession, allowing peasant men, and only men, to express themselves as citizens and economic actors by cutting and burning trees at a massive scale. During this period, Paraguay not only had rapid economic growth, it had some of the fastest deforestation in the world. And it was also the site of one of the major international human rights scandals of the 1970s, the genocide of the Ache Guarani who lived in these forests. Thousands of Ache died, hunted, rounded up, infected, and deprived of any way to live from the forest before an international campaign slowed down some of the worst violence and created a reserve system. Reading the literature on this genocide offers an unusual window into agribiopolitical contradictions of the era. A handful of European and Paraguayan anthropologists were behind the international campaign against genocide, but they were opposed by US anthropologists and lawyers who argued that the violence did not technically constitute genocide since it was not organized by a state with a specific intent to erase a particular group. In their argument, the deaths were due to the advancement of agriculture, and therefore they were similar to other indigenous societies disrupted by settler frontiers. In other words, for them, mass killing didn't count as genocide if the primary reason behind it was agricultural. Like development narratives about land and labor then, social justice narratives at the time tended to leave environmental factors out of the equation, indeed required that environment remained invisible from arguments about human well-being. This, more than anything, is the reason I think it's useful to talk about agripolitics as a form of relational violence rather than this purist understanding of biopolitical crimes as something committed only against groups of people. Once we open up the discussion of violence on settler frontiers to one that includes genocide and ecocide together, regardless of intent, we also open up new ways of understanding the other forms of violence that monocrops always bring with them. So of course, once this cotton, which became a 2 million hectare plantation of cotton in this area, once that was established, having destroyed all of these other forms of life in the area, it then itself got attacked by new life forms. So on the one hand, there were fungal infections of the seeds and roots of the cotton plants, and later caterpillars. And then finally, the boll weevil, which attacks cotton the world over, finally found Paraguay, and in a very short period made this whole crop quite unsustainable. The same project to create rural welfare through extensive violence against trees and indigenous people, in other words, now had to turn inward, creating a public health system for cotton, doling out increasingly toxic pesticides throughout the region, increasing sort of armies of agronomic extensionists who would go out and try to control this beast. Eventually, the cost of the killing became too high, and cotton collapsed, and with it, the entire welfare scheme which depended on it. Now, between 1985 and 1992, Paraguayan agriculture changed again. Now, partly this was due to a well-known geopolitical realignment towards the end of the Cold War. International development agencies that had fostered the agrarian reform and crop science suddenly changed the way they gave out assistance. Before, they'd been institution builders, tacitly protecting the Stroessner dictatorship by bankrolling the system of rural welfare in order to maintain an anti-communist ally. When they stopped doing this, they also stopped promoting plants like cotton. In fact, they stopped promoting specific plants altogether and replaced their crop programs with programs for transparency and good government. This is the moment when soybeans, a crop that government had barely paid any attention to previously, began to enter cotton country. Soy was a neoliberal product, a flex crop intended for processing overseas that was grown at large scale, required significant private financial investment, and a constant barrage of chemicals just to stay alive. Cotton growers slowly got displaced by soy because they couldn't buy into the new system, and because soybeans didn't require much labor, and also because the amount of pesticides now being sprayed by planes and other large machinery in the area made it very unpleasant to live there. So as a result, soy also concentrated land and wealth, getting rid of people, houses, gardens, and trees from the landscape, gathering up all that destruction caused by the cotton boom and turning it into something even more uniform. In this most recent agribiopolitical regime, then, from the 90s onwards, monocrops were no longer about sustaining human life and all the contradictions that this implied, but became entirely about economic growth. It's true that they'll still tell you in the ag fairs in Paraguay, as they do in Iowa and Saskatchewan, that this scale of production is necessary to feed the world. But the term is an abstraction and a platitude. What's not abstract in anyone's mind is the way that the biotech harnesses the vital force of particular organisms by stripping away most of their relationships with other organisms. And in some places I've written about this as kind of a new form of, or a recapitulation of vitalism, but concentrated on specific organisms as biocapital. Now, the life being promoted here is the increasingly simplified and therefore also increasingly fragile life of the monocrop itself. It's fragile in situ and it's simplified in situ, but it extends its complexity outwards. It requires tons of agricultural chemicals imported every year, and this number just kind of keeps going up. The ag industry, the exploding university programs in basic science and agronomy, the network of private labs, and the massive new government regulatory departments are all part of an apparatus that holds this incredibly lucrative field in place. And yet together, the pesticides, erosion, and degradation of the forests and the dispossession of smallholders all drive the disintegration of that pioneer lifestyle that used to be called rural welfare. The agrarian technology apparatus, once justified as necessary for welfare, now turns against rural populations. So at times, the kind of agrarian science that was built initially for welfare becomes the thing which welfare organizers are trying to fight against. The prevalence of pesticides, for instance, used to be thought of as something that made people's lives better, and now they're thought of specifically as something that threatens human life, driving an exodus of the poor to the cities, and leaving, therefore, more room for the concentration of particular plants in the countryside. It's not as though neoliberalism is without its notions of justice, both for people and other living things. It's just that these tend to remain institutionally separated by the same failure of agrobiopolitical imagination that held genocide and ecocide apart. So modern environmentalism in Paraguay, which emerges almost at exactly the moment with the fall of the Stroessner regime, the Rio Convention, all around 1990, modern environmentalism becomes a public discourse in Paraguay, is overwhelmingly concerned with deforestation and the destruction of charismatic ecosystems that comes from these landscapes. It's built of a contrast, in other words, between two parts of our original triptych, They lead to the institutionalization of nature parks that cater to middle-class visitors looking for elusive megafauna, or to anti-deforestation laws that mandate that 10,000 hectare soy farms need to have a certain small percentage of that reforested, usually with something like eucalyptus, which is the forest version of a monocrop. On the other side, social and environmental justice politics remain focused on that other contrast, on romanticizing what rural welfare was all about and trying to hold it in place against the onslaught of land concentration and pesticide clouds. Here, populist laws aimed at preventing smallholders from selling their land are complemented by phytosanitary laws limiting the most egregious forms of pesticide use. And in a way that we could talk about both of these projects, the conservationist one and the critique of land grabbing, also make reference to a version of Hernando Bertoni's original vision, but always this kind of Bertoni that is separated out into an environmentalist on the one hand, a populist on the other hand, a pro-indigenous person on the other hand, but never kind of in the full complexity of the figure. What was most striking to me in this research was the way that phytosanitary measures enacted in the name of environmental justice tended to imagine agriculture and human welfare as incompatible forms to be held apart. From 2005 to 2015, for instance, the most hotly contested piece of agrarian regulation in Paraguay was what people called barreras vivas, or living barriers, which soy farmers were mandated to plant along the edge of their fields so that pesticides would stop poisoning people going by on the roads or going to school or their neighbors. I make the argument in the book that this seemingly straightforward intervention had almost no effect on pesticide exposures, but it did contribute to a cascade of political scandals that eventually led to a governmental coup. The agribiopolitical aesthetics here are striking. On the one side of the barriers are soybeans, whose life force is maximized in the name of capital accumulation to the detriment of all other forms of life in their midst. On the other side are people whose well-being has been reduced to a sort of bare life, the right not to be doused in toxins. Only at the highest level of abstraction is there any sense that people and plants might profitably thrive together in this picture. Once the phytosanitary form of the barrier became the leading agribiopolitical symbol, it took other forms as well. So from activist imagery that expressed the defense against monocrops in starkly militaristic terms to those that expressed their newfound fear of agricultural technology by building bulwarks around what they saw as a territory of lies. In an extension of this, which deserves its own study, over the last several years, soy lobbyists have moved to exert more control over science curriculum at the National University and mounted a full takeover of the National Science Council with the express purpose of choking off funding to epidemiologists who are studying pesticide exposure. Now, the year after the coup, the new president, the coup was in 2012, and in 2013, there was a brief period where this idea of the living barrier reached its kind of maximum absurdity. This time, instead of planting elephant grass or sugarcane to protect neighbors from pesticides, the state planted police to protect pesticides from neighbors. It was a scandalous caricature and it didn't last long, but it said something about the agribiopolitical place we'd arrived at, where human interests and plant interests were so opposed to one another, held apart by barriers of grass or police. In either case, the eventual outcome seems to be a world of increasing segregation between people and plants, a utopia of complete urbanization to keep people away from destructive monocrops. So I'll just end there, and what I hope is obvious here is that this state of affairs is an echo of a way of thinking development after World War II, in part to fight fascism and to avoid a repeat of the Holocaust, but which had profound effects on the critical study of agriculture. Among other things, it helped to fortify a taboo against the kinds of thinking that insist on deep entanglements between people and other living things. It's not just that we've inherited a form of capitalist agriculture that can only improve through simplification, speeding up, reduce labor cost, and killing competitors, but also that we've inherited an environmental justice narrative that can only understand human welfare as a singular ethic that stands outside of the welfare of other living things. That's it for now.